Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to what I'm sure is going to be an incredibly interesting and rich discussion here. I'm Rich Powell. I'm really sorry. We may need help down here in the front. We may need help. I'm Rich Powell. I'm the CEO of ClearPath Action. Incredibly happy to be here. Our mission is to advance policies that accelerate breakthrough innovations that reduce and remove global emissions. We work on a number of technologies, but a primary technology where we spend a lot of time is on nuclear energy, and especially new advanced nuclear technologies. And I'm so delighted we're going to have a conversation about that here today. I do want to start by giving enormous thanks to the Institute and the team, both the Ideas team and the Energy and Environment team. ClearPath primarily works with conservative policymakers on these issues, and I can confidently say that there is no organization more committed to pragmatic, bipartisan solutions to our major clean energy and climate challenges than the Aspen Institute team at all levels. And so I want to say a huge thanks to their entire team. So let me start by introducing our two incredible discussants here. First, to my left, is Governor Mark Gordon of the great state of Wyoming. He was reelected in November 22 with the largest win of any gubernatorial candidate in Wyoming history and the largest margin of any gubernatorial candidate in the nation in 2022. So not bad, if you track that kind of thing. He also served as Wyoming State Treasurer from 2012 to 2019 when he was sworn in as governor. He grew up on a family ranch in Casey, Wyoming. And importantly, the governor is also slated to take over as the next chair of the Western Governors Association, and he's taking that over from Governor Polis of Colorado. So welcome to Aspen, Governor. It's no Jackson Hole, but it's not bad. It's not bad up here. Next, I'd love to introduce Chris Levesque, the CEO of TerraPower. He's the CEO and president of TerraPower. They're pursuing next-generation nuclear energy solutions and the development of therapeutic medical isotopes, another very important part of their business. Prior to joining TerraPower, Chris led major new reactor build efforts at both Westinghouse and Areva and oversaw projects in both the U.S. and Finland. He began his career as a nuclear submarine officer, which is why he's sitting up so straight. He served on both the USS Boise and the USS Will Rogers. Before I turn it to them, just a couple of quick introductory thoughts. So we did this last year. I think I recognize some folks in the audience that were maybe in a similar discussion last year. Raise your hands if you believe that climate change is a major issue of global concern that we should take serious action on. Almost everybody. There's maybe a couple holds. Keep them up, keep them up, keep them up, keep them up, keep them up. Keep your hands raised if, to help solve that challenge, you would support the building of an advanced small modular reactor here in the Aspen Valley. Even better than last year. That's good. That's good. We're gaining ground. We're gaining traction. So I think what's important to note is that this conversation has changed radically from where we were in the clean energy and climate space, even as over just the past couple of years. We recently collaborated with a global public opinion group called Potential Energy on a global public poll on support for nuclear energy. Some of the really interesting findings: 75% of Americans support new nuclear energy if given the option. Poland, even better, 92%. 60 to 75% of each political party supports nuclear, so this is no longer a conservative issue. This is Democrats, this is Republicans, this is independents. And more than 80% of every age group is either neutral or supportive of new nuclear. Right? So that's a huge change in global public opinion, which is just in time, because we are in the midst of a second nuclear renaissance in the United States, driven by new advanced technologies, amazing support from state policymakers and federal policymakers in DC, and utilities want new nuclear. Today, we're going to hear about an amazing five-way partnership that's helping build that future between the great state of Wyoming, between TerraPower, the leading developer of advanced nuclear, between the U.S. federal government, the Department of Energy, between the town of Kemmer, Wyoming, very important, and Pacificor, a major utility, part of the Berkshire Hathaway energy family of utilities. And this partnership has really flipped the narrative of nuclear on its head. It's gone from nuclear being something where there was a lot of local community opposition to something where local communities were literally fighting to host this plant, as though it was a corporate headquarters relo or something like that. So it's an amazing new narrative in the space. And we should remember, though, we're going to talk a lot about this specific project, but the goal here is to build not one reactor, but to build hundreds of these reactors, maybe thousands of reactors around the world, if we actually want to take full advantage of the benefits of this technology, this amazing technology, and everything it can do to advance clean energy and drive down emissions and help us with the climate challenge. So, with all that, at this session last year, one of the questions that I received was, what about Bill Gates and that nuclear reactor? Where's that thing at? How's that going? So I'm going to break protocol, Governor. I'm going to go first to Chris, if you don't mind. And I'm just going to ask, Chris, tell us about the Bill Gates nuclear reactor. What's the deal with TerraPower? Where are we? How is Bill engaged?
Okay. Thanks, Rich, and it's great to be with you, Governor, and great to be here in the Mountain West, because it turns out that first deployment of these natrium reactors, someday there'll be hundreds, is going to begin in the Mountain West, in Wyoming, in Colorado, in Utah. So this is where the story starts. What's happening, and why are we talking about nuclear now? Well, I mean, nuclear has been running in the U.S., providing about 20% of our electricity for 60 years, quietly. And those plants are quite old. Electricity demand has been kind of growing really slowly over the last 10 or 20 years. But between now and 2050, electricity demand is going to explode, really, because we're electrifying transportation, we're electrifying industry. So we're going to triple electricity demand between now and 2050. At the same time, many coal plants, for environmental reasons, they're also reaching economic end of life. We're losing the 24/7 coal that's really been supporting the American grid really reliably. We're adding lots of wind and solar. There's a lot of great development with wind and solar, but we need to remember wind and solar are intermittent. They come and go throughout the day. So at the same time, we're adding electricity demand greatly. We're retiring this baseload coal, which states like Wyoming have been really powering the western part of the United States for close to a century, supporting economies all along the West Coast, and you have something similar on the East Coast with West Virginia. So people are realizing we're going to need nuclear. Internationally, China and Russia are building more plants than the U.S. We've been running these plants great in the U.S., but we haven't been moving on to the new technology. And what you're going to see internationally is Africa, Indonesia, places like that are going to turn to nuclear energy. And there's a big concern in both parties, with policymakers, with Congress, that we're getting behind. And that's the reason under the Trump administration, something called the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program was started. And it was really recognizing that to compete with Russia and China, we're going to need a serious government investment and a serious private investment to literally catch up. So this was a competition that was run about 3 years ago. And TerraPower was fortunate to win that. We've been around for 14 years now. Bill Gates is our founder. He's our lead investor. He's super involved with the company. He's made himself an expert on nuclear energy. I don't know how he finds the time, really, to do that, and vaccines and everything else. But he's totally on board and even participated in our last fundraise. So when we won this grant, to help fund the first advanced nuclear reactor in the U.S., we mentioned a few candidate sites in our application to the Department of Energy, but we didn't finalize that site. And it was just over 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago last winter, Berkshire Hathaway Energy, who's a partner of ours, brought us to see Governor Gordon. Because in Wyoming, there were 4 coal plants that were scheduled already for retirement. Again, for EPA reasons, some were reaching economic obsolescence. And boy, we went to see the governor with Berkshire Hathaway, and a lot of people are talking about advanced nuclear in the Mountain West right now. At that time, no one was. And I just have to thank Governor Gordon for his open-mindedness, his vision, his leadership in listening to us and saying yes rather quickly. And I think the reason we've kind of felt so at home in Wyoming is because the state knows energy. There's a high energy IQ there, and the governor already knew nuclear because of Wyoming's history of producing uranium. So it has been really the best place to develop this first project. Right now we have 900 engineers working on the design of the project, and we're working on a construction license with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We'll start some non-nuclear construction before that. We've already kind of mobilized the site and done soil borings, and just last month we had Bill Gates there. We walked the site with Bill and Governor Gordon, and we plan to start full construction in 2025, and then the nuclear part of the plant will start construction in 26, and we'll be making electricity in 2030. And that's just the first one. There's other opportunities in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and that's really where we'll do our first deployment.
Well, so that's a perfect segue. So you're in your office.
Sure.
TerraPower comes in, Pacific Comes in. They're proposing this project. You're an energy state. I think a misperception that you're not at the leading edge of energy. Misperception. How did you perceive this, and how did you get this done in the state?
Well, it was a wonderful collaboration, and when Chris came with Rocky Mountain Power, it was really an opportunity to start talking about the future. Up until that time, and let me just sort of go back a little bit, Wyoming, we export about 80%, a little bit more than 80% of the power we produce. Whatever you're going to do with energy, you're somehow going to do it in Wyoming. Largest coal producer, 9th largest reserves of natural gas. We are a great solar field. We have a legacy of nuclear. And of course, with the coal production, people were talking about let's get rid of coal plants. And those are jobs. Early on in the Biden administration, I called with Governor Lujan Grisham of New Mexico, a Democrat, same sort of situation. These are jobs, they're high-paying jobs, they're communities that are established over time. We need to do something other than just talk about how we're going to turn miners into coders. We need to actually find a way to make an industry whole here. Along with that, though, came this idea about how do we make our domestic energy supply reliable, distributable, and secure. One of the biggest pieces of this was the ability to make sure that we provided our own nation's energy, something that we hadn't done for a long time. In fact, all of our nuclear fuel at this point comes from Russia, which has not proven to be a great partner in some ways, as you can see. So our uranium industry, which I think we're 92 conventional plants that are running, 93 conventional plants running in the country. I remember talking to Larry Kudlow, Donald Trump's economic czar, and saying, if you're going to tariff everything in sight, we have a domestic uranium industry that really needs to get back on its feet. It's clear that climate is a huge issue. It's clear that we need to move aggressively forward on alternative forms of energy. It's also clear that intermittent forms of energy have their own particular problems, so we need base load that we can commit. So let's do something about tariffs on Russian HALEU, which was the fuel of choice. We're still a little bit behind the curve there. That's a piece of, it's great to have the advanced nuclear reactor coming online. We're also going to have to build the supply chain in front of that. That's going to be one of the big challenges. But for Wyoming, what this did is it said to a community that was being told by the country, you're moribund, everything you know about energy is bad, you need to, and I remember somebody saying, you're not going to have jobs here, but we'll figure out what place for you to have jobs. Imagine that for a family, because it's not just who works in the coal mine. It's the fact that the shopkeeper who sells their food, or the restaurateur that their family goes out to on Friday night after the football game. All of that was going to go away. So to have a charge come back in that is, yes, a nuclear plant, probably a little bit less of a workforce, but all the potential ancillary manufacturing that can come from that. This is where the state really stepped in and said, we're going to recraft our education system so that from our research university right down to our community colleges, we're going to make sure that our workforce is equipped, ambitious, and ready to meet the challenges of the future. So that's kind of what it did for us. shot in the arm.
Yeah, I mean, and the broad potential of new nuclear, new advanced technology, especially at these retiring sites with the workforce and the interconnects to the grid, it's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Right? You can see that happening
Yeah.
across the state, really across the country.
You bet. And Rich, just, I really appreciated the raise of hands. There is no question that we have a huge climate issue. Absolutely no question. The urgency with which we have to address that is something that Wyoming has doubled down on. We are the first state in the nation that said it's not carbon neutral, it's not renewable portfolio, it's carbon negative. We are absolutely dedicated to getting CO2 out of the atmosphere whatever way we can do it. I have experience when I worked for Apache Oil Company, we were able to manage a ranch in a way that actually sold 5,256 annual metric tons of CO2 that we sequestered. So there are things that we can do. Wyoming is totally dedicated to that. This is the issue. We need to get off of, it's only one technology and into, let's make sure that we use all the resources we have to the best of our ability, figure out how to geologically sequester CO2. And to that point, just yesterday when I got to be chair of Western Governors, Governor Polis and I signed a mutual agreement for direct air capture and carbon sequestration. So Western governors are on the move. This is the place where we're going to solve climate issues. And that's my soapbox. Thank you. We can go back to what the nuclear can provide.
And when, if we have time, we should come back to direct air capture later, because that's another amazing place that nuclear could be applied. So the governor mentioned fuel, right? Mm-hmm. Upside, nuclear has the best fuel profile of any, thermal generating resource. Downside is it's still challenging. And as he mentioned, Russia's the major supplier today. This has been a challenge for you. Mm-hmm. So can you talk a little bit about what is HALEU and what is that supply challenge?
Sure. And I really have to start with how nuclear plants work and why they're so reliable. And the war in Ukraine has really brought this to light, because what you have to realize is when you load fuel in a nuclear reactor, you just loaded fuel for 2 winters of heat, 2 years of electricity for your industrial sector. You can't interrupt that by bombing a pipeline or a rail system. So, nuclear on balance has really grown in its kind of energy security value since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we're seeing that across Europe. So today's fuel for our reactors is what they call low-enriched uranium. Big source of it is places like Kazakhstan. Canada's doing a lot of mining. Wyoming is re-entering the mining sector. And after you get the uranium out of the ground, you have to enrich it. You have to raise the amount of what they call uranium-235, and that's what lets you have fission. Many of the new advanced reactors need a higher enrichment. It's called HALEU, high assay low enriched uranium. It just means that when you enrich your uranium, which you do in a centrifuge, you run the centrifuges longer to get the enrichment level high. It's still far below what you would need for any kind of military application. And it turns out that Russia is ahead of us here. Russia already has a HALEU enrichment line. When we started the project in Wyoming, our plan was to use, unfortunately, a Russian source for that first fuel load. We had something called the Energy Act of 2020 that said, hey, the government's going to fix this. We're committed to creating a supply chain here. But when the war happened, February of last year, within days at TerraPower, we decided we were going to have no part of using Russian fuel. That was a decision we made as a company. We also knew it wouldn't fly in Wyoming, okay? Kemmerer, Wyoming, where we go, it's one of the few places where I still see a Marine Corps recruiting billboard.
Oh, yeah.
Okay? I mean, it's a red, white, and blue place, and we, for the people of Ukraine, too, made a very quick decision. Even though it hurt our project, it put us 2 years behind. So I'm really confident that with private investment and our engagement with the U.S. government, they're going to follow through on the Energy Act of 2020, and we're going to create this capability. It's not rocket science, okay? We've enriched uranium a lot in the U.S. before. we need to renew this capability, not just for our nuclear industry, but to fuel our submarines and aircraft carriers. So, I think working with government, we're going to get that new fuel supply in place for our 2030 startup. I do want to mention, how did we get there, though? How did we become so dependent on Russian uranium? And it has to do with, we've been pushing for low-cost electricity. Our regulated utilities across the U.S. have sought low-cost electricity, and their PUCs have pushed them for low-cost fuel, right? And what did the Russians do? The Russians dumped low-cost material on the U.S. market, and that disincentivized American companies from developing mining and developing enrichment. So we really need to learn from that. And I think, Putin's attack on Ukraine really brought to light that we need to be making long-term investments in energy if we're going to have a secure energy supply and triple electricity demand between now and 2050.
Anything to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, when Chris says dumped, it truly is dumped. The labor practices, the environmental practices in other countries just are not what ours are. They don't come to standard. And so really we do a lot to help our environment when we bring stuff onshore, where we really do have the strongest environmental record. So.
If you ever want proof of this with your own eyes, go to Google Maps, go to the satellite image, Google nickel Russia, and look at it's Mordor really created. I mean, just the level, the complete lack of environmental controls across so much of the industry, some of the ancient Soviet industry, some of the new Russian industry is really alarming, right? And so bringing this back is a huge environmental win from every perspective. Chris, you talked about Kemmer, this very red, white, and blue place, and it's not just Kemmer. There were 4 communities kind of fighting over this reactor project, competing for it. Governor, I'll start with you. When you're going around to communities across the state, obviously this is a complicated discussion in many of those communities. Many of them are, as you said, they were traditional coal communities, and some of them are facing the closure or the retirement of their facilities and their mines. What are you hearing from other communities in this? And to what extent are folks open to more of these and other technologies as well?
Yeah, well, I have to hand it to TerraPower, and you did a great job of meeting with the communities, answering the questions. Our tribal nations you've provided information to. So it's been a really great effort on your part to make sure it's transparent, hear the issues, what are we trying to do. You're right, every community is really worried about what happens in a future where coal no longer plays a role in the community, and what is that going to mean to the economy of the area? So there were communities that were very much looking at this. The TerraPower site that they selected was universally acclaimed as, yes, we know this is where it's going to start. Yeah, we're a little disappointed it's not here, but we think the next one could well be here. So as you talk about transition, mind the fact that we already have transmission in certain places. In fact, one of the biggest challenges we have for transition is what are we going to do with grid infrastructure? Now, everybody says, let's build grid somewhere. Just not in my yard. I don't really want that to go anywhere near my place. And it's an extremely expensive and very time-consuming process. The largest wind farm, Sierra Madre Chokecherry, the second largest in the world, largest domestic one, we just broke ground on, about 2 weeks ago. It had only been 16 years in permitting. So when you think about what it's going to take to be able to deploy these resources, we already have legacy assets in terms of grid infrastructure in certain locations. That's what makes a place like Kemmerer such an ideal location. And you have, as I say, a dedicated, ambitious workforce that is ready to go. So what happened is that every community started saying, well, how can we get a piece of this action? And it isn't just the plant. As I said, it's also the fact that technology is going to advance. If we stop thinking about let's regulate ourselves and start thinking about how do we innovate into the future, then we start opening doors instead of closing them. And to me, that is where Wyoming is really trying to lead. How do we innovate our way to the future instead of regulate our way to whatever that is that we're going to regulate our way to?
I should mention on that permitting challenge, for those of you that are not familiar with the Institute's amazing work on permitting reform, the Cleaner, Faster framework that was incubated here at the Institute, a portion of that actually just became law as part of the debt ceiling deal, the administration of NEPA. And broadly, this is going to be so important to development, regardless of your technology, whether it's wind or pipelines to capture CO2 or new nuclear. It's just going to be incredibly important, and the Institute has done fantastic work on driving that. You know, Chris, from your perspective, you know, the other communities that you're talking to, I mean, you know, how are they seeing this opportunity from your perspective, or maybe from your partner PacifiCorp's perspective?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a great experience to do town halls in these 4 Wyoming communities, because you know, the whole discussion started with, you know, who are we? You know, same question you asked, Bill Gates, nuclear energy, explaining our story, and it also began with talking about this, you know, 92 nuclear reactors in the U.S. and how safely those have been operating, and then how natrium is different and even safer. It'll have less waste. So it was really, you know, just a cool experience to talk to these communities. And one thing I learned through that was about this high energy IQ in Wyoming, because, you know, many states in the country who aren't energy producers don't really understand where the electrons come from, okay? But in Wyoming, because of, you know, your resource extraction and, you know, all of the power generation and great transmission, people understand energy, and it made sense to them. So yeah, the truth is we had 4 communities vying for that. And I got to tell you, when I was in high school and college, I was watching, I grew up in New Hampshire, and I was watching Governor Dukakis block the opening of Seabrook Station in New Hampshire. It wasn't even in his state, but he was able to block the opening of it for 3 years. So, you know, nuclear energy's always had this story of, you know, not in my backyard. And here we had 4 communities saying, yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
Yes.
And the 3 that we said not now to are all candidates for future natrium plants. We're talking to other power companies in the Mountain West, like Excel. There's multiple coal plant sites that are unfortunately coming to, you know, an end of their life, and I think, you know, pivoting them to advanced nuclear makes so much sense, because you have the grid connection, you have the cooling water, and probably the greatest resource that we're reusing is the team. So there's 200 folks working at the Naughton coal plant in Kemmerer. Some will retire between now and 2030, but the rest, they can come to the nuclear plant. And it turns out that most of a nuclear plant pretty much looks like a coal plant. You make the electrons the same way, you spin a turbine. You know, the thing that's different, instead of breaking a, you know, hydrocarbon molecule to release the energy in coal, we break a uranium atom. So after that, you know, how we make the heat is different, but after that, many of the skills and much of the equipment would be the same. So that's why it makes so much sense to, you know, take this great workforce and help them turn a corner, and then the governor talked about, you know, all the kind of knock-on effects on manufacturing, community colleges, university. I talked to our TerraPower intern class earlier this week. We had 2 University of Wyoming students in our intern class.
Fabulous. Yeah. Well, and you know, it's a rosy picture we're painting, and it is really a rosy picture. But just to be honest about this too, you know, to sort of share both the good and the bad, that there was a little bit of trepidation. There's probably still is. You know, Bill Gates, who's Bill Gates? Why is he in Wyoming? And then there's a whole bunch of social media stuff that happens too. Turns out Bill came, had a coffee with local residents in Kemmerer. He's a very approachable guy, answered the questions they needed. And for me, you know, ultimately it's Bill Gates who is helping to finance this. It's Berkshire Hathaway and it's Department of Energy. Wyoming we're charged with being the regulator in many ways, so we have to be very much engaged in how well the plant runs. This is a problem, I think, for governors really across the state. As I said, Governor Lujan Grisham in New Mexico, another big uranium state, has some of the capacity down there to be able to enrich. But there's a lot of concern there too, and her Department of Environmental Quality also has to regulate. So I think being transparent about what that regulation means, making sure it's efficient, because I think TerraPower, when we were there, it was like 4 NEPA analyses, and then possibly 2 more just for the road going in and so on and so forth. And somehow we've just got to make that happen a little more efficiently. If we're going to be, as Vail Resort said just the other day, we're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, and you're looking at a 16-year horizon for permitting, we'll have to do what Congress does and stop the clock. I mean, it just isn't going to happen.
It was very good to see John Podesta here yesterday talking about the need to go even further on permitting reform and finding lots of common ground with conservatives and progressives in Congress on this. So I, for one, am optimistic that we'll get more of this fixed, but clearly an enormous need. I do want to open this up to audience questions in a moment. Governor, can I just ask you one last question? So uranium mining, you know, obviously major potential opportunity, as you said, both in Wyoming and New Mexico. Eventually, maybe also uranium processing in Wyoming, certainly in New Mexico. What's a uranium mine look like? Like, you know, what are we talking about here when we say we're going to expand uranium mining? What is that?
So if you were to look back at probably 1960s, 1950s uranium mining, it was open pit mining with tailings piles and stuff that was blowing around, a lot of concern. But, you know, we've gone way past that now. What a current permutation of a uranium mine looks like is an in situ operation. So it's water soluble. There are some amendments that can be put in it. If I remember, Kazakhstan likes to use hydrochloric acid, but we don't. And so what you have is a typical 5-spot. There'll be a well in the center that's going to draw out more water than is pumped in on the outside. It'll move through the ore, pull up what is the ore, and then that gets cast and taken to a conversion facility. The conversion then upgrades it and eventually it makes it to where it can be enriched. So once the ore body is depleted, there's reclamation that happens. It's because there's really very little surface activity. You know, it's a matter of plugging wells, making sure the water's gone back to ambient condition, and then you move on.
Yeah. I had the pleasure last week of touring GE Hitachi's fuel fabrication facility down in Wyoming, down in Wilmington, North Carolina. And the thing they pointed out to me was that an enriched uranium pellet the size of the tip of my pinky had as much power in it as a ton of coal, right? So it's also just tremendously less total stuff that we're moving around, right? Well, on that note, I could ask these guys questions forever, but I would love to open this up to the audience. I'm going to go first to this gentleman in the black and white checkered shirt, and I believe someone is coming around with a microphone. If you wouldn't mind identifying yourself when you ask the question, and just make sure you've actually got the mic in hand so that everybody can hear it and so that they can get it for the recording, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you. My name is Mike Von Gray. I actually have 2 questions. The first one is for the governor. With your state's leadership and visionary adoption of these technologies, I wonder if you are also considering the adoption of any of the next generation energy storage capabilities that are now coming out to allow the more efficient retention and delivery of some of the intermittent sources like solar and wind. And the second question is really whether, with the growing public acceptance of these technologies, whether you see, on the topic of nuclear waste storage, any enlightened or more flexible adoption of things like the significant investment that were made in Yucca Mountain over all those years and ultimately didn't get deployed.
Yeah, well, let me take the last one first. I think what we're looking at with TerraPower, I'll let Chris correct me, but what we're looking at is significantly less waste generation. There are some of these technologies that could actually cannibalize some of the existing waste we have to sort of help with that issue. Yucca Mountain, as you point out, certainly ran into a roadblock, and I think that's a little bit the issue that Lujan Grisham is dealing with as well. People are a little bit concerned about what we do with that. That is going to be an obstacle we're going to have to talk about and move forward. To your point, that's one reason why we're so anxious to have an all of the above energy strategy, so that you can use the right technology where it makes sense. TerraPower and Sierra Madre Chokecherry are roughly equivalent in size. One takes 274,000 acres, and I don't know what yours takes, a lot, not 274,000 acres. So there's sort of gives and takes on each of these. Storage is going to be a huge issue. Now, full disclosure, one of your residents was a camp counselor of mine years ago, very good friend of mine, Amory Lovins. And, Amory was talking about storage issues back in 1978, 1979. There were some really innovative things done with compressed air. There's also some other remarkable technologies that even Governor Polis was just talking about the other day.
Can I turn to you, Chris, also on the storage front?
Yeah, and on storage, one thing we didn't have time to discuss is one really unique attribute of Natrium is that it has built-in energy storage. So we use fission to make heat, but then before we go off and make steam, we heat a really large tank of molten salt. Same process that concentrated solar plants use today. And what that lets us do is change power really quickly. When demand changes, which it does, or when wind or solar is coming and going, our reactor can surge really quickly. And that's why it makes so much sense in the Mountain West, because we're losing that steady 24/7 coal. We're adding lots of wind and solar, which comes and goes. On used nuclear fuel or waste, that's always the question, right? My taxi driver asked me about it yesterday, and we talked about waste the whole time. So for sure, used nuclear fuel after the fission happens is super hazardous, okay? But one thing about nuclear is everything's more dense, okay? Our whole reactor sits on one site. The full plant's like 40 acres, but our whole reactor just takes up 1 acre. If you think of all of the waste from those 100 nuclear reactors that have been powering 20% of our grid for the last 60 years, all of that used fuel can fit on basically a football field. So is it hazardous? Yes. Do we need to manage it? Yes. But it's very dense, and that's the entire waste stream from our nuclear fleet. Okay, there's no smokestack at a nuke plant. That is the waste stream. I get asked, when we were doing the town halls in Wyoming, we got asked a lot about waste, because right now the US is storing that on nuclear power plant sites because we don't have a place like Yucca Mountain approved. I mean, as a nation, we need to move on with that. Finland they have their repository. I lived there for a while. But in the meantime, it can be stored very safely. And like I told people in Wyoming, when I was in the Navy, I worked at a submarine base where we refueled submarines, and I lived there with my kids. And my 10-year-old son, I am not kidding you, could ride his bicycle up to a rail car that had a spent core. And, that's my testimonial.
Just one more word on this energy storage thing. As Chris mentioned, the idea that he's got a molten salt storage system that's a result of innovations in concentrating solar power, right? We are just in the early days of the immense combinatorial innovation that is to come in the clean energy space. We're gonna reconfigure all of these things dozens more times in this journey to net zero and unleash all kinds of potential. If you didn't see her yesterday, the CEO of Malta, a technology that's a freestanding storage technology using this molten salt energy storage, is here and on the campus talking about this. So just unbelievable opportunity in that space. Sir, I believe you in the blue checkered shirt were next, and then maybe we'll come to this gentleman. We'll come up front to this gentleman right here in the white hat next.
Hi, Paul Lemming. I'm just curious if these small modular reactors are water-cooled, and how big an issue is water availability in the West going forward for the proliferation of the plants?
Take a shot.
So, today's 92 reactors are water cooled. And one of the problems with water cooling is water boils at 212 degrees, and when it gets hotter than that, it generates pressure. So today's plants, while they're very safe, are very expensive because you have to have these high pressure piping systems, you have to have those really heavy reinforced containment buildings that we all know, is kind of characteristic of nuclear. So one reason to move to Generation 4 technologies like natrium is there's a bunch of different coolants that are being used now. Our natrium plant, which means sodium in a few different languages, is actually cooled with liquid sodium. And what that lets us do is have a low pressure plant. Sodium doesn't boil till something like 900 centigrade, and our plant operates at 500. So there's this huge margin to boiling in a kind of Fukushima type scenario. In Fukushima, the fission stopped, no problem, right? It was that cooling you had to provide after. Our cooling is provided by just air. You don't need to start a pump or a fan or anything. And because of that margin between the operating temperature and the boiling temperature, we have really an infinite period. We could have total lights out like they had at Fukushima, and the reactor stays safe. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I was just going to say the point about water, really critical. We're blessed this year with a little bit of a surplus, but certainly the trend we've seen, particularly in the Colorado River Basin, has been going the wrong way, and it's causing all of us to think about that. So, this is what I keep telling the DOE when we talk about hydrogen, when we talk about, what kinds of reactors we want to use, all of that. Water is precious in the West. It's our most precious commodity.
And just to fully answer the question, because we make the electricity with a steam plant, that does require cooling water like we have at the coal plant. So in Cameron, Wyoming, we're going to repurpose that water supply that the coal plant is using now. But I think what you're going to see all around the country is more and more plants that need to rely on air cooling. And you'll lose some efficiency, but that's just going to be something we have to deal with because water is so short.
Many people don't realize 40% of the water consumed in the U.S. is consumed for thermal power generation. It kind of goes up in steam. It's on par with agriculture. So this is a massive use of water. Massive use of water. So I think we were going to go to you there, sir.
Yeah, thank you much. And really interesting panel. And I appreciate the governor's belief in the urgency of the climate change issue and addressing that. Now, coal, of course, is probably the single biggest contributor, burning coal, single biggest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. And I'm wondering about the cost of nuclear versus the renewables plus storage, and also, given the urgency, the timeline in terms of getting these plants online in time to deal with aggressive targets on reducing, climate impacts. So, can you just share, any of you, what does the latest data show in terms of that cost comparison, and I mean like total cost, not just of building the plant and operating it, but dealing with the waste and all that.
Yeah, we're going to need a mix to have the lowest system cost. So there's study after study now that shows we're going to expand wind and solar a lot. And as we, we're only at 20-something% right now in the nation. And as we go 30 to 40, 40 to 50, you have to keep compounding how much storage you add. So the incremental cost of the renewables is going to go up. And so lots of studies show that kind of the best way to top off a carbon-free grid is with 20 to 30% nuclear. So I think you have to think system cost, and lowest system cost is going to require that kind of portfolio. I mean, if you look at Bill and his investments, he's investing in nuclear storage. He's an investor in Malta. So that's his basic premise is we're going to need that portfolio.
Yeah, and I want to touch on the effort to curtail coal has been successful. Now transportation is the #1 source of domestic CO2 emissions. I would postulate that if people start having to worry about driving a car, this is going to be a bigger challenge than, this has been the sort of problem with coal. Who knows a coal miner? Let's shut that business down. It's polluting the environment. Let's get rid of it. We've got all these great, wonderful wind machines that can do wonderful things in solar. But there are costs to those too. There's about an 8-degree rise in temperature at soil surface under a wind farm. You've heard about the birds and everything else. This is not in any way being pejorative about wind. It has a place and it will be part of the future. But one of the things that's been most frustrating about this conversation is we haven't been honest. We don't talk about the CO2 that is sunk in the concrete, that's sunk in the tower. The fact that the biggest load on our grid in Carbon County, Wyoming, are wind towers, because they have to eat the oil to keep that lubricated during the winter. They're the #1 demand for that. So to me, our conversation has to do two things. It's not just let's get rid of coal and we fix the climate. It is, we know now that each power source has its pluses and minuses. We've got to talk honestly about what those are and realistically about what the horizon on transition looks like. There's some low-hanging fruit that we can do that will help ease that. Regulatory reform is critical to that piece. Chris, Ned Lamont from Connecticut just called and said, because New York won't allow us to get natural gas from Oklahoma, we're having to export, or we're having to import it from Russia to be able to fuel our power plants. How can I do something with nuclear? That was a great thing. We've done this thing with renewable fuels, where we take soy oil out of the Midwest, we put it on a rail car, take it to New Mexico, where it gets pre-treated, bring it up to Wyoming, where it gets refined, and then ship it to California. The net energy cost in that effort is something that we should be aware of. I'm not saying renewable fuels don't have a place, but we've got to think really deeply about and honestly about what these choices are. And our domestic production is substantially less than what's overseas. So our ability to get these technologies out around the rest of the world, particularly in third world nations, that's going to do the best job we can for reducing climate.
I'll say one last word on this. Go to the Princeton Net Zero Project, the most ambitious attempt ever made to track how we would actually get to a fully net zero America across all sectors. Go to the major scenarios that they look at for net zero. Interestingly, it's actually the relatively low, still a lot, but relatively low renewable scenario that then relies heavily on carbon capture and on nuclear, in addition to a lot of renewables. That actually produces the lowest system costs for the US energy system in a net zero future when you incorporate heavy doses of all these other technologies into that mix as well. The Princeton Net Zero Project. I think, let's go over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for the discussion. My name is Jean Gould, and I'm with Marathon Petroleum, and kind of drilling back into kind of the community issues. And it sounds like you engaged, it rolled out pretty well within the community. Were there any lessons learned, like if, when you go on to your next communities, that you would do different in your community engagement in that outreach?
Good question.
It's really gone pretty well. I think lessons learned are it takes a lot of time. And so in our company's situation now, our highest priority is getting that first reactor built correctly. The US doesn't have a great record of finishing these projects on time. So it was recently announced in Pacific Corp's resource plan that there could be some plants in Utah as well. So now we're thinking about having to do a similar process in Utah while talking to the other 3 sites in Wyoming. So I guess the lesson is it really takes people, and you have to do that balance between taking people off your project, because you need knowledgeable people too. You need people who can explain the safety, and it's just a real commitment. It's not something that just your government group can handle. You have to send your engineers to the community.
I think we might have time for one last question. Fast hand there in the middle, blue blazer.
Hi, my name is Adam Frisch. I spent 25,000 miles driving around southern and western Colorado running for Congress, but one group of people accuse the other group of people of not understanding the science, and the other group of people accuse the other group of people that don't understand the math. And I'm a huge believer that this math problem needs to be explained a lot more by fellow Democratic leaders, because there's a complete lack of urgency about how important it is, and it's somewhat disingenuous, with all due respect, to talk about things that are going to happen in 2030 and 2050. And so at some point, I hope more people get together and have this conversation, because I just don't see the policy conversation moving beyond where it is now when there's a binary conversation happening. And I just wanted to comment on that. And we've been doing. I don't need to convince you, Governor.
No. I'm just saying you heard it here. I mean, this is a great group, and it's exciting to talk about this technology, and it's also important to talk about the issues that we face. And we aren't going to get anywhere if we're just yelling at each other. It's important that we have honest discussions about where energy is headed.
I can just say from my vantage in DC, working quite a bit with members of Congress around this issue, the dialogue has fundamentally changed in the last 7 years to one about whether there is a problem to solve, to a big, complex, occasionally nasty argument about how to solve the problem. And that is a radically better and healthier place to be than in whether there's a problem to be solved in the first place.
Well, and Rich, one thing too, the other thing that's exciting, there's opportunity here.
Yeah.
You know, what a cool time to be alive. More technologies, more opportunities, more chances to be engaged in solutions that can actually have a bottom line benefit to people and to businesses.
What a perfect way to close this out. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks, Steve.